though the relationship I have with it formed over a very short span of time. Since my original playthrough last September, I gravitated towards the game in every moment of sickness in pursuit of equal comfort and immersion. I listen to the classic soundtrack on repeat as part of a scary music playlist when I need to force myself to write ahead of a deadline. Embarrassingly, I often find myself lost to the siren song of the steppe ambiance, envisioning myself wandering the barren expanse of grassland while on the verge of nodding off in the goth club. Most importantly, Pathologic was the game I was fully in the throes of when my maternal grandmother, whom I was very close with, suddenly passed just this summer. Pathologic is about many things. It's about the cruel trials of survival, community stabilization, the magic of childhood, industrialization, colonialism, and more. Though increasingly, I feel that Pathologic, for me at least, is about grief. Not the bad grief often mispronounced by me in my head as bad grief, but the mournful emotion of loss. A note before we get started though, while this video does explain some basic plot beats of the Pathologic games, it's operating under an assumption of general familiarity with the game either from playing it or having watched one of the major other videos out there on the game. To explain more of the plot would artificially pad out the video I want to try to keep on the concise side. I will waste no time in spoiling major parts of the game that may radically shift your perception of the story, so if you desire an intended experience with some of these games, please return to this video after playing them. You may also ask, why am I making a video on Pathologic when so many people have already? Well, dear viewer, my grandmother died and I have something to say, so it's my turn to make a video essay on my favorite game. Pathologic was originally released in 2005 by Russian studio Ice Pick Lodge, and was later remastered in 2015 with Pathologic Classic HD. This remaster was partly necessitated by the borderline incomprehensible English translation of the original game. The baseline premise is that you play as one of three healers: the Bachelor, Daniil Denkovsky, a famed thanatologist from the capital; the Haruspecs, Artemy Burak, a surgeon local to the town returning from his studies; or the Changeling, Clara, a strange girl who woke up in an empty grave with miraculous powers, who also only unlocks after completing one of the other two routes. Each story captures more or less the same series of events from each character's perspective, while the other two non-player healers are essentially acting as something akin to the worst versions of themselves. In each route, you arrive in the unnamed town on the River Gorkon the day a deadly disease breaks out known as the Sand Pest. You also learn that the night prior, Simon Kine, an influential town elder, and the supposedly immortal man the Bachelor was here to investigate, was murdered, as well as Isidore Barak, the town's only member of an indigenous doctor caste, permitted to cut open bodies, and the father of the Haruspeck. You have 12 days to address the plague and come to a solution. At the end of these 12 days, if you manage to ensure that all of your bound, special townsfolk assigned to each healer, are free of the plague as well as the bound of another non-player healer, you receive a letter from the elusive powers that be, requesting that you meet them at the Polyhedron, a confounding feat of architecture that defies the laws of physics constructed partially out of its own blueprints that also houses the majority of the town's children. At the base of the Polyhedron, you are transported to a scene of a garden at nighttime, inhabited by two towering children who address you as their doll come to life. It's revealed that the entire town and all of its people were the playthings of children named Measly and Thrush, children who have returned from a funeral of their grandfather who died of the sand pest, and were using this game to cope with their grief. They beg you, their doll, to help save the town they love so much, even though their playtime for the day is almost over. For the game is almost over. Afterwards, if you save all of the bound, you can directly confront stand-ins for the developers of the game, who implore you not to fault the children, for there is another layer to the healer's non-existence, that of them being not only dolls instead of humans, but characters in a video game. The confrontation with the developers feels born of an obligation to appease the players, likely upset that their trials and tribulations of the 12-day plague were all for quote-unquote nothing. People notoriously get upset with ending twists that reveal that the entirety of an already fictional set of events were all a dream, despite the fact that these events are indeed fictional. You knew it from the start that they were fictional, all a game. Pathologic also rarely went out of its way in the name of immersion to strictly enforce the sense that you are truly inhabiting your healer, or otherwise try overly hard to mask the game-like elements of the world, or the second-level framing of the entire events of the game being events in a play. A frame story that is made more obvious in Pathologic 2. This is evident in one of your first conversations that you can have speaking to an executor in Tragedian who seem to address you, the player, directly instead of your character. The confrontation reminds the player of the facts that they knew all along. The characters are mere collections of, quote, poorly rendered polygons on a screen. These assertions do nothing to appease the outrage and grief of the bachelor and Harspec. The changeling, on the other hand, doesn't seem to care, being all the more aware of her status than the other two, having met the powers that be prematurely. These words are intended solely for the player, even if you stubbornly insist upon speaking through the voice of the character. Clara could also be argued to be closer to the player in terms of role than our other two healers, by virtue of her root being unlockable and her unique status as an entity born entirely within the confines of the game, absent any illusion of past or substance beyond what is presented to us. But I digress, for the ultimate topic of this essay is the subject of grief, and it would be very shallow of me to say that my experience of grief in Pathologic solely hinges on the connection of shared mourning for a departed grandparent. Even prior to this personal loss, this moment was perhaps one of my favorite moments in the entire game, as it recontextualizes everything. Particularly the prevalence of children that was established as early as the opening cutscene that precedes the main menu, wherein main child characters are seen holding a funeral for a doll. Children are the lifeblood of the town, and the most key factors in your success, especially in your ability to reach the secret ending that reveals all of this. It is only through children, particularly the sweetheart by the name of Teensy, that you can acquire the coveted schmauters through trading. Schmauters are an experimental mixture of crushed up pills that cures the plague at the cost of nearly all your health. You will need approximately 7 or 8 cures to cure all of the bound at the end of the game, and in most cases these cures cannot be acquired in full without trading. Interestingly, it's also the same character model for Thrush, one of the powers that be, which can be interpreted as her inserting herself into the story to help out her dolls. Only through the children can everyone be saved and the town's future secured, yet a terrible cost is demanded from our healers, bearing the burden of truth. Likewise, while the powers that be may be able to distract themselves with grim games of make-believe to their heart's content, they still eventually have to contend with the reality of their loss. They must also contend with the inevitability of loss of their beloved miraculous sandcastle pit, as the plague scenario originates from the presence of rot. This is why they, and the developers, care about the choice that the healer makes in the end. It addresses their real problem with the plague standing in for the rot. No matter the choice made, there is still mourning to be experienced, of the entire town, of the polyhedron, or of those chosen to be sacrificed to save both. Which is a bit unclear how this translates to solving the children's problem. They're shown offering food to the sandbox in the ending cinematic, which may very well work if the sandbox is truly miraculous enough to bring one of its dolls to life. For the children, this still remains a meaningful choice, the outcome of which they would still be invested in. According to the albino you can meet in Clara's route, the town is only a month old, which in the eyes of a child, particularly a grieving one, must feel like an eternity. Though the dolls they are playing with have only been playing their roles for a matter of days, they are still beloved toys they have some measure of attachment to. Even the bachelors and the Haruspex' dolls that they refer to as a scary clown doll and a doll with a ripped-up face respectively. They are even more meaningful in their root as the doll that came to life and spoke with them, even if the two of them responded aggressively to their existence. Pathologic 2, released in 2019, is not a sequel to the original Pathologic, but rather a restaging of the original game featuring only the Haruspex. As previously mentioned, the game opens more explicitly with the play framing, with the player as the Haruspex witnessing the utter devastation wrought by the plague on the final day, wherein he failed completely to develop an actionable cure. After failing to plead his case to the Inquisitor and the General, he gets an opportunity to restart the play by the man staging it, Mark Immortel. He then experiences disorienting set tutorial sequences accompanied by the fellow traveler, a man framed as a devilish death figure. The same general beats of the original root story takes place. Artemy arrives in the train station and has to kill 3 men in self-defense. He learns of his father's death, for which he stands accused of causing, and he is hunted down ruthlessly. However, this version of Artemy has a great deal more than the classic Artemy. He has more childhood friends with whom he has grown distance: Reuben, Lara, and Bad Griff. Reuben shares in his grief over the death of Isidore to the extent of violently blaming Artemy alongside the rest of the town. Lara, meanwhile, is sympathetic, having also recently lost her father, a grief that torments her on the regular as she lives alone in her large house. Bad Griff seems on the surface less connected to grief, having not been impacted directly by a narratively relevant loss. but he later finds himself in the throes of despair after the arrival of the Inquisitor. Upon speaking with her, he seems to lose his mind, believing that he is a mere puppet with only one path to follow, and a complete lack of control over his life. After the funeral for Isidore on day 2, Artemy can partake in a trading game tradition with the townsfolk, where they exchange items that carry with them love and warmth of the people who originally carried them. This game is done for the purpose of eventually fostering love between the townsfolk and Artemy. He can say in the conversation afterwards that he gives with this trade some of his grief, for it is all that he can truly offer, in hopes that his suffering may be diminished. For most of the game, after the outbreak, in between desperate bids of survival, Artemy is able to frame his personal grief over the murder of his father as a quest for vengeance, one with the expectation of a clear target to be found to assign all the blame. Ultimately, though, Artemy will learn that his father brought this fate upon himself. Isidore consulted with Simon on the town's need for another outbreak of the disease that ravaged the crude sprawl 5 years prior to function as a necessary purging, an immune system response that would strengthen the town. He intentionally sought out the plague, a plague which was born of the Earth's pain induced by the construction of the polyhedron. He was killed by Foreman Oyun, who learned of his decision and mercy killed the man he once called a friend. Artemy can choose whether or not to forgive him, but it is nothing to ease the grief. Not that enacting vengeance would have been much of a balm in the first place. Artemy is confronted with the reality of what kind of person his father was. Someone who would commit such an unspeakable horror as unleashing a plague upon the town he knew would kill thousands of people based on the outcome of the first outbreak. He mourns not only the death of the actual person, but the idea of his father. A father he cannot help but still love, for love is his path and the major overarching theme of his route. Isidore says to him about the choice he needs to make between two incompatible choices, that of the past and the future. You need not choose, not yet. Moreover, you've already made your choice. Your actions did, for they were driven by love, whether you wanted that or not. Love came from understanding. Understanding creates connections. Connections are the lines. The lines are love. Pathologic 2's incarnation of Artemy is deeply connected to the town, through not only his roots with the indigenous culture, though such a relationship is complicated by his mixed heritage identity, but through his bonds with his childhood friends and the new bonds he forged with the children of Isidore's list, particularly Sticky and Murky, who he takes into his care. Connection is the path to saving others and sparing the town, even though you can't save everyone. In the dream Artemy has if he fails to save Murky from meeting her so-called friend, the sand pest incarnate, she says she wouldn't have died if he'd connected with her more, that he saves things that are broken by connecting with them. Grief is an inextricable counterpart to love. Some would call it the price of love. All that is loved must eventually be lost unless you happen to die before you get the opportunity to mourn. If one experiences love, they are not immune to grief. It's only natural that Artemy's root, which concerns itself most closely with the theme of love, would inevitably be most associated with grief, with the ever-present directness of the loss of his father. Mechanically, Artemy is doomed to always lose someone, as in Pathologic 2, it's incredibly difficult to acquire enough cures to save everyone without an immense stroke of luck with the roll of the die at the end of each night. Typically, it'll end up being souls that you are least connected to, such as often the case with the Kinds in my playthroughs, as I would much rather reserve my resources for saving the children on his father's list, or the other characters that Artemy is more closely tied to. Any character that dies will haunt you in the form of their ominous last words at the end of the game, pertaining to what their path in life was or was intended to be. In the final moments of the ending, you will see them replaced by a tragedian as a mark of your failure. They will intone, "Where once a person was, now but a gap remains, this rupture will not mend." Additionally, Artemy's life in Pathologic 2 continuity is marked by the early death of his older brother Ursher. It's unclear whether this death took place before Artemy was born or after, and if he has any memories of his brother. This is revealed exclusively in dialogue with Katerina Soborova, who confuses him for being either Artemy or Ursher. To this, Artemy might respond, "No, Ursher was my older brother. He died young. I'm Artemy." This minor detail is one we as players can only speculate on at length, armed with the knowledge that the loss of a sibling at a young age can pose an immense torment regardless of the particulars. Even if Artemy was too young to know his elder brother, his father would inevitably be afflicted by the pains of loss which would carry over into his treatment of him. A man so culturally preoccupied with the concept of connectedness and the legacy of his people would reasonably be strongly impacted by the loss of a son. Each ending also marks a loss. There are two primary endings if you are not late to your fate or make a terrible deal with a fellow traveler: the nocturnal and the diurnal ending. In the nocturnal ending, the polyhedron is preserved, and with it, the culture of the kin. Most of the adult non-members of the kin are sent to wander the steppe until they catch their death, including all members of the major three families. 3 new mistresses will ascend: Grace, the gravekeeper's daughter; Taya Taichik, the mother superior of the kin; and Clara. Aurochs, bulls of steppe legend, wander the town to ring in a new era for the kin to be led by Artemy. In the diurnal ending, the polyhedron is destroyed and the heart of the earth is punctured, killing her. From the living blood, cures are made to heal the townsfolk at the cost of the kin's way of life in the face of the death of their beloved earth. Aspidie and the changeling, or at least one version of her, are condemned to death as beings born of the earth. Life in the town is preserved at the grave cost of betraying Artemy's own culture. In both endings, Artemy must live with his choices. That is, if we assume the story is to continue past the boundary of the conclusion of the play, a framing that we were reminded of with our final discussion with Mark and Mortel, where we can choose to remain Artemy or take control of the theater. Artemy is personally directly responsible for a number of deaths in the different vein, from the men he killed in self-defense, or directly through the failure to treat. He is torn between 2 halves of his identity, the paternal part that is a member of his indigenous culture, and the maternal part of him that is embedded in the town. There's a greater discussion to be had on the topic of indigenous identity and the manner in which the kin are portrayed in the game that far exceeds the scope of this video, though it would add a compelling facet to the discussion of the conflicting emotions felt by Artemy. There is also one person you cannot save, no matter what you do: the Inquisitor Aglaya Lilik. Aglaya is an interesting character, one I hope to explore in a future video pertaining to the women of Pathologic. In the brief time Artemy spends with her, she falls in a sort of love with him because of his connectivity with the world and its people, through the lines, as well as the degree of agency he exerts over the world as a result of him being controlled by a player. She recognizes that he is the closest thing possible to a real human being with free will, having seen through the unreality, and learned that all which surrounds them, even Artemy's dear children, do not exist. She attempts to escape her fate by fleeing on a train. Regardless if you go with her, she will be apprehended and shot by the general's men. Death itself, the cause of much grief, is vital to the structure of Pathologic 2's narrative. Death is something that cannot be cheated and comes with grave consequences. Upon each death, you are transported to the theater where you are confronted, most often, by Mark Immortel, who berates you for butchering your lines. For you must remember you are an actor merely playing Artemy Barat, and imposes a penalty of sorts. Most are mechanical, such as reductions to your maximum health, exhaustion, or hunger, but others are stranger, such as removing your inability to hug others or introducing the chance to transform the organs and bodies you autopsy into cotton, wool, or button. You cannot escape these penalties, as reloading a save from when you last touch a clock will carry over these penalties. Your deaths are permanently recorded on each profile no matter how far back you go. There is one way, however, to cheat death, but in doing so, you cheat yourself out of an ending. On your 7th death, you are greeted by the fellow traveler who offers you a deal absolving you of all past and present penalties for dying. He does not tell you what the cost is when offering the deal, only that it will be significant to you. The ending you receive instead is one where you are berated by the executors for your choice, and you find the other 2 healers, the Bachelor and the Changeling, rehearsing their lines, preparing for their chance at center stage. Mark Immortel is livid with you for ruining the production. Because you accepted the deal, thus accepting a partnership with death, you have violated the sanctity of the play by aligning yourself with humanity's unconquerable limits. The play can no longer be or feel real. The penalties for dying were necessary to strengthen the thematic connections of the play and the understanding it ushers. He gives up on you as a character and turns instead to the Bachelor, who he hopes will respect the play more. After you leave the theater, you find yourself on a train car once more with the fellow traveler, with whom you are now stuck with until the end as he ventures off into the wider world. You have lost your precious town and all the connections you have known. Artemy will continue his work as a doctor elsewhere, staving off death for as many people as he possibly can, just not within his hometown. To cheat death is, in a sense, to cheat yourself out of grief. You purge yourself of all the consequences tied to death, and the only way to do so is to purge yourself of all meaningful connections. For if you lack ties to a wider world or community, how much grief can truly be left in your wake? Conforming to the laws of death is instrumental for Pathologic 2's mechanical story and relates closely to the flow of time, a connection that will presumably be explored further in the upcoming Pathologic 3, which features time travel as a core theme. The time travel of Pathologic 2 is present in a more linear fashion that is not intended to be used over much, as seen by the carrying over of consequences for death. A game where time travel is intended to cheat death, or at least circumvent it, is the DLC/tech demo for Pathologic 2 Marvel Ness. You play as the Bachelor during a near worst-case scenario on day 10 of the Plague, wherein Artemy, alongside many of the townsfolk, is dead, and the last remaining area of town free of infection is the stone yard. He awakens in a coffin in a small room at night, where he is then confronted by an executor who asks him to accept his death. To accept is a simple death with no knowledge gained, but refusal will lead you to repeating the 10th day. This is a time loop scenario where the bachelor is slated to relive the events of this day over and over again until he accepts either death by plague when confronted by the same executor at night, or finds another option. Each night, the bachelor finds a group of townsfolk that are behaving as if he is already dead or dying of sandpest. The bachelor is praised in the event that he accepts his death. The only alternative option, the only ending other than accepting death, is if you follow a series of set events and meet certain conditions. Then you will be able to discuss games with the nighttime executor and speak to them directly as the player. Only by transcending the boundaries of the game and the character of the bachelor can you pursue an alternate option, break the rules. Whilst there is an acknowledgement of the player and their agency to make such a choice and recognize the imposition of game rules, there is none of the original framing of the bachelor as an actor or indications that he is a doll. He is entirely revealed to be a video game character. Death is once more circumvented by the introduction of a meta move, this time one more direct in the moment that's akin to the conversation with the developers in the secret ending of Classic. Daniil spends the time loop trapped by the knowledge that he himself can do nothing but die in the end. His salvation only comes in the form of a force outside himself, which the very existence of violates his precious sense of autonomy and once again reinforces the idea of his inherent tragedy, that he, as a video game character, was never going to meaningfully die, therefore his lifelong quest to defeat death was entirely irrelevant and in vain. He mourns the chances of his success, which could never have been achieved through his means as a character. To be trapped in a time loop is to be trapped in perpetual grief and, in Daniil's case, perpetual denial, also known as the first stage of grief in the classical model. Drawing comparisons to Pathologic 2, you realize that the game is also a time loop on a wider scale. Instead of a day, it's 12. You begin the game of 2 at the very end of day 12 with the worst possible outcome and plead for another attempt. Whilst the final day state of day 12 in any ending does not resemble the start of the game, it very well could in spirit depending on how many of the bound you let die. What should have been a victory lap around town becomes a tour of ghostly tragedians representing the ruptures that will not be mended due to your direct failure. Each playthrough of the game is yet another iteration of the time loop, another performance of the play, acted out on the full scale of events paralleling the more no-nonsense approach to life and problem-solving that the Haruspex is compared to the Bachelor. The Haruspex still engages in smaller-scale time traveling anytime he makes a mistake and dies, even if the consequences of this death are still carried over. Mechanically, he has the ability to revert back to any previous moment in time and try again, though certain rolls of the die are unavoidable. Both men are doomed to certain fates. In Marble Nest, Daniil as a character is doomed to death without the gamified intervention. In Pathologic 2, Artemy is doomed to have to make a devastating choice and inevitably lose some of the bound. Artemy comes off as more accepting of his fate than Daniil is. Daniil, who will endlessly repeat events in a desperate hope of circumventing an inevitability, as he has done all his life. Daniil, who will seemingly skip around in time in Pathologic 3 in order to straighten out the correct order of events and how things really happen. Artemy is freer than Daniil not just because in Pathologic 2 he has the combined blessing and curse of being controlled by the player character, but because he is able to accept the inevitable and does not fight against it in the same idealistic manner that Daniil attempts. In Classic, the executors on the final day of the Changeling route even say when asked about the Haruspex that he was the only one who could attain true freedom, for he was not facing the same sort of dilemma as the Bachelor. It is this freedom that also, as previously mentioned, allures the Inquisitor. The Haruspex is grounded in more realistic goals, less abstract ones, ambitions centered on his love for his community and family. A belief system born of the communal ideals of the kin, whereas the Bachelor is tormented by abstract, impossible goals that the Executor in the same conversation say tempted him towards destruction. While grief is essential to Artemy's route, and is further elaborated on in Pathologic 2, this isn't to say that heavy themes of grief isn't present in the other two routes of Classic. Apart from the general overbearing sense of loss that comes in tow with the plague, Daniil confronts his personal grief over losing his life's work in the form of the destruction of his lab Thanatica before the revelation of his nature as a doll. The doll revelation alone is a severe blow to everything he stands for given his quest to defeat death. How can an unliving thing defeat something it will never experience? His life work never existed, and even if it did, it would be entirely meaningless. He also endures the grief of losing Ava to suicide, a woman who embraced him and accepted him into her home. Clara suffers the grief of losing the family that once so graciously adopted her, as well as the inherent grief of living the brief life she has, emerging fully formed from the grave at the onset of the plague, eternally unsure if she will continue to exist upon its cessation. Had she not been so preoccupied with matters of survival during the outbreak, she would be undoubtedly overcome with the anticipatory grief over knowing such an abbreviated and horrific life. Not to mention the pointless tragedy of her ending, wherein she sacrifices all but two of her bound, people who are framed as being sinners of some kind, with the exception of Lara and Yulia, who seem to be in her pool of bound because they were left over. They can be redeemed through their sacrifice. Thus, redemption is highly questionable, as I personally feel that redemption is better sought through living and making amends for one's mistakes through action in this context. Clara is interesting in that, if we are to reference the stages of grief once more, she seems to represent more of an acceptance stage. If you speak to her of the revelation that the powers that be while playing as the Bachelor, she tells you that she already knows, and that she's merely a toy being controlled by children. Though she also implies that there is a greater force beyond the children that pull the strings. She also says that the Haruspex seems to think that he's the Haruspex, but he doesn't care, suggesting that he would be in a similar position as her regarding the revelation of this truth that Daniil cannot accept for the life of him. Both Artemy and Clara's acceptance make sense, for Artemy is first and foremost concerned with the life and reality that he knows, which he feels most connected to. Instead of being like Daniil, hailing from a seemingly imaginary world of backstory, he has ties to the town itself that he can ground himself in. Artemy, when speaking to Clara on the final day, interprets the revelation as him being human, whereas Clara is not. Clara does not seem too bothered by this, as she believes she has a great advantage over him by virtue of him not knowing what she is. Clara, by necessity, must remain remarkably well adjusted for a being that sprang to life at the beginning of the game, with the immediate complication of her dual nature. A nature that was truly both her all along, and disputes about her character by the power that be. She also has to eventually grapple with the fact that, according to the developers, her root, her ending choice included, was slapped together because there simply wasn't enough time to work on it. Changeling is all about not having enough time. Not enough time to live or exist in the first place, too painfully aware of the truth of this reality as a consequence of being a third character intended to be played after another route where the secrets were likely unveiled. You are most aware that you are playing a game, posing as a character when you play as Clara. You are aware that none of this is real in a different way than playing as the Bachelor of the Haruspex. Characters will tell you earlier that this town is not real, such as the aforementioned conversation with the albino who tells you that this town is only a month old, and her premature meeting with the powers that be. The quests in her route take a formulaic pattern in the second half of the game, where you routinely have to do the same set of actions, finding your sister and tattling on the Bachelor/Haruspex. The game feels more like a game, and Clara navigates it accordingly. In addition to fighting the seemingly unstoppable plague with her miraculous healing, Clara is also constantly fighting against her reputation, which is constantly lowered by the seeming actions of her evil twin that she lied into his supposed existence and confronts on the regular in the second half of her route. She is desperate to straighten out her image as the good-natured healer she wants to be, working her miracles. To learn that against all her perceptions that it was all her and that there was no evil twin is a devastating fact. Even though you saw the evil twin on screen, something Clara brings up in conversation with the developers, she was still never real. Mechanically, it all makes sense. Clara's route has a lot of downtime with the brief nature of her quests, particularly the repetitive ones towards the end of her route, and often the only way to stop the steady fall of reputation that happens after a certain point is to sleep. A period of time where the Clara we know and play as is inactive, so that another wretched Clara could act. In Pathologic 2, her nature is unclear. Reasonably so, as we are seeing her from an outside perspective. She claims to have history in one of the pantomimes wherein she says she fell in love with a boy named Matvey at age 6, though she is called a liar by the Bachelor. Multiple Claras can be seen at certain points in the game, not on the same screen of course, that feel like different Claras. There very well could actually be multiple Claras in Pathologic 2, but there's no way of knowing. On the topic of what we cannot know, is the fates of the nameless townsfolk. Those who contribute to the faceless, nameless statistical toll of dead at the end of each day. The samey figures with minimal variation that wander the town and concern us only in their trading value, or what they might represent as a boost in reputation for aiding them to no real effect unless you are Clara in Classic, who can heal the cloth-bound infected back to health with her hands. Others you can only help by killing them more gently with painkillers, or administering treatments that only prolong suffering before the inevitable death, for random townsfolk are not worth using precious cures on. You are not mechanically incentivized to truly help them. With the sheer numbers of loss of life and the devastation that is seen in every infected and burned district, it can be inferred that one thing that is common to the townsfolk will not lack is a consistent threat of loss. Everyone will know someone who perished either from the plague itself or from the violence that followed. No one will be spared the pains of grief, and no one will be able to bear the burden of another's sorrow, for they are too immensely burdened themselves. All who have not lost have at least seen the corpses and coffins lining the streets, seen and been directly impacted by the societal devastation brought in the plague's wake. You, the player, will not have room to mourn them. You will become desensitized to the grotesque loss of life and register the scenes as character models you can hardly place a generic name to. You may be impacted on principle by the sight of a dead child in a makeshift hospital cot, but you will not experience anything more, for they are not of the properly named few. You can only feel a certain lump sum of grief for those you have not been able to personally engage with. A numb sense of absent potential, the knowledge that as the days advance, you have fewer trading opportunities. For in the end, you are chiefly concerned with your own survival, your own success in a time of desperation. Even if all the bound survive to the final day, you haven't saved everyone. So many, too many, died because you took too long and prioritized the survival of others. This knowledge will inevitably haunt our healers henceforth if they are granted the accursed luxury of continued existence. Narratively, the named dead cast tall shadows in the town, even before the second outbreak. Not only are the events of the game kick-started by the deaths of Simon Kine and Isidore Barak, the looming specters of the late mistresses Nina Kaina and Victoria Olgumskaya continue to sway many of the living characters. Their lives have irreparably changed the town, and their deaths continue to haunt not only their families, but the body of the town as a whole. In Pathologic 2, Capella has a dialogue wherein she comments on how the grief still impacted her, and how it is at its worst when her mother died when she was 6 and she climbed into her coffin, refusing to leave until she was convinced that her mother needed to be buried. She also becomes fixated on the sound of pianos being played across the town that she believes to be a ghostly remnant of her mother's memory as they play her melody. The changeling ultimately dispels this notion in a conversation with the Harusbecks, where she says that there is no white mistress in any shape or form anymore. Capella, if she is told this, appears bothered by the confirmation that there seems to be nothing after death, no way for her mother's spirit to linger. Beyond the individual family-felt grief, the absence of the two mistresses carry an immense weight over the town. Visually and symbolically, this is represented by their artistic depictions surrounding the theater stage, suggesting their influence yet lingers to orchestrate the events being played out. The spirits of Simon and Nina still linger in actual ghostly hauntings in the form of their respective possessions of Georgi and Victor. Prior to this, Maria carried part of Nina's soul in her heart. This was accomplished because the Kynes, much like the Bachelor, had their own aspirations of conquering death by commissioning the construction of miraculous structures that act as containers for immortal souls of their most important members after their deaths, called focuses. Two of these focuses include the Crucible and the Polyhedron. Another character dead by the start of the game played a role in the creation of some of these focuses, Farkad, one of the Aniratechs who built the town and also worked alongside the Stamatin twins. He built the cathedral in Stillwater. His true name is unknown, as one or both of the twins murdered him and buried him in an elaborate grave under a fictitious name, a name that is a tribute to a legendary historical architect. Farkad lives on through his creations, most notably the cathedral that was commissioned by the Kynes. The cathedral serves no religious significance and was built purely for the sake of advancing the Kynes' interests in the link between space and time. In Pathologic 2, the townsfolk speak of the cathedral as a source of time which is distributed through the clocks, and in Marble Nest, time is mysteriously suspended for all those who dwell in the cathedral. The cathedral was designed to be a focus for the Kynes, but failed, according to Maria, because it was too human for the bestially selfish town. A faithless, godless cathedral cannot settle a miraculous soul. Only Ava believed in the place so earnestly that following her suicide by jumping off the balustrade, her soul was unable to inhabit the place as a proper focus. We even speak to her apparition at the end of the Bachelor's route, yet another ghost. It's revealed in a line during the Changeling's route that the Bachelor is the only one who can see her. Another form of ghost is the ominous intonation of a masculine voice implied to be Isidore, reading out the passages from the Step's creation myth and certain parts of the Step in Pathologic Classic. In Pathologic 2, Isidore's voice looms over you non-diegetically in the form of dialogue that ushers in each new day with cryptic statements. This echoes the inevitable inferred thoughts of Artemy, who feels the mounting absence of his father, who he might believe would have handled the events of the outbreak more aptly than he could have ever prior to the revelation of the truth of it all. This voice speaks following a pronouncement of the nameless, faceless dead, numbers that rise and rapidly lose all meaning as an accurate quantification of the devastation. Inventories of failure that can easily be taken as a personal from the perspective of a healer who is supposed to circumvent them. Also worth noting is that there are seemingly more dead parental figures than living ones. Apart from the highly significant death of Isidore, Nina, and Victoria, Artemy's mother, Lara's father, Taya's father, Grace's parents, and the parents of the majority of the other children except for Khan and Capella, with one living parent each. Grace is an interesting case study of grief as she immerses her entire life in grief. Personally impacted by the loss of her father, the Twirene-addicted former gravekeeper, she spends her time living alongside the dead of the cemetery, talking to and singing for them. Her late parents were strange characters. She recalls her father pouring milk and twirine over the graves and her mother sweeping them with her hair. According to the corpus on the Keeper of the Dead, her father felt the agonies of the dead so acutely due to his twirine usage that he resorted to pouring milk on the graves alongside offers of sugar to ease their pains whilst dulling his own pain with substances. He imparted this belief and experience to Grace by insisting that she and his wife also consume a great volume of twirine. He feels the dead so intimately that he cannot believe for a second their existence is over, for their pain echoes through the graveyard and torments the sensitive senses of his twirine-addled body. He takes on the care of the dead as an unpleasant but essential duty. In Pathologic 2, Grace has the supposed ability to speak with the dead, but the usage of the seance is a slow death sentence she can only afford a few more conversations with. Grace signifies that death is not the end, but it is the end of a great deal of things, including potential joy. The dead live on in such a tormented state from the perspective of the sensually susceptible twirine-addled mind. A wealth of Pathologic's grief dwells in the fringes, in the unspoken. Survival consumes the waking thoughts of the present moment, but always there lingers an echo of what happens next, if there is even to be a next. In the early days, the scars of the first outbreak marred the face of the town enough so that you begged the question, what would the scars of the second look like? Is it more merciful for the entire town to have been the product of woesome children's imaginations, its structures mere constructs of sand, and its mass graves of dead no more than scraps of stuffed fabric? The gravity of these considerations is reliant upon your level of personal investment as a player. Are you content with accepting the confines of fictional reality presented to you in the form of a video game, enough so that you do not dwell on these human dimensions? Or do you succumb to the juvenile fantasy of projecting your grief onto these characters, despite how strongly you are reminded of their unreality? Do you allow yourself to be rendered one and the same as the poor measly and thrush? Pathologic seeks to remind you of the play, both in the sense of the theatrical play and the play conducted by children, and to an extent as you as player of the game. This is an activity intended to be for entertainment by most, but Pathologic has a reputation as supposedly challenging the notion of games needing to be fun. The games can be brutally challenging if played in the intended manner, and its subject matter is so dark that you're running the risk of willfully subjecting yourself to depressing material. You get out of the game what you put into it. The more you allow yourself to be absorbed by its world, ideas, and characters, the more you will find yourself affected by the depicted devastation that you can only blame yourself for as the player, for you chose to beat the odds and continue playing the game. The game will not entirely punish you for this choice. There are tragedies inherent in all final choices, but the thematic core of most of Pathologic's endings is one of hope, primarily in the form of the town's children, the next generation. Those among us that most truly remember the value of play and the utility of it as a vehicle for interfacing with the world's cruel miracles. Those who might suffer the immense world-shattering misfortune of the first loss. In some ways, Pathologic is a comfort game solely in the sense of, well, if I think I'm having a bad time, then Artemi Barak is surely having a worse one. I happen to be that kind of person that, much in the same way one would use a painful heat patch to alleviate muscle pain, you replace an intolerable stressor with one much more tolerable, one that is critically more under your control. While much of the game mechanically is centered around the feeling of being out of control in the face of an insurmountable force as the plague until the final day, as a player, I have the power to remove myself from the situation at any time. I can decide to quit the game and return when it's more bearable. This is a luxury that the characters do not have with their circumstances, nor do I have with my torments that I am seeking to escape by playing the game. Much in the same way that the classic soundtrack, particularly the indoor theme, was the soundtrack of my fear-powered productivity, Childhood Grave from Pathologic 2 became the soundtrack of my grief. For an entire month, I abided no second of silence. When I wasn't drowning myself in videos or playing Pathologic itself, I had the song playing on repeat. Now I'm what I would kindly term a musical idiot. I lack the language to describe anything musical despite my passion for a music-based subculture. I cannot accurately pinpoint certain sections of a song with appropriate terminology and identify them as the source of the swells of emotion that I feel. All I can tell you trends towards poetic terms and notions. What I can tell you is that those opening notes, the gentle rise that dissipates into a steadying note, felt like guidance. Reassurance that my experience was not to be suffered truly alone. There was hope, a hope that my grief will one day be transformed as my body and mind changes around it. Hope that I would graduate from my most consistent experience of grief that registered as an unceasing toll of bells, plain factual reminders of my loss, of the facts I was desperately terrified that I would forget, and in the process inflict harm on those around me also affected by her absence. At the same time, the track evokes a feeling of memory recollection, particularly recollection of the hazy memories of childhood. Memories sparked by familiar sights of childhood wonders now coated in dust and grime. Images of carefree memories surrounded by friends who barely resemble their tottering younger selves, and loved ones who exist now only in the realm of memory. The thoughts you find yourself with when you see a rusted swing set you used to haunt, or your beloved childhood doll, now sun-bleached and missing parts. Thoughts that are easy to succumb to melancholy in the presence of, burdened by the idea that you will never be able to return to carefree times. But just as easily, these thoughts can make you appreciative of how far you've come, and delight in the simple reminders of life's joys, even the inaccessible ones. Grief and love commingle, each emotion at risk of being lessened in the absence of the other, together coalescing into a new tender feeling that is a cousin to nostalgia. Childhood Grave plays in the nutshell, a location exclusive to Pathologic 2 that serves as a meeting place for the town's children that don't gather in the polyhedron. The map notes that only children live in the house. The name of the house alone is interesting because of the touch description of in-game nuts that reveal that there is a game amongst polyhedron-era children of the town wherein you guess the name of a well-traveled nut, shake it, and listen to the stories of the soul trapped inside. In Marble Nest, the touch description states that a focus can be held by an object of any size, a polyhedron, a room, a nut. Yet another safe haven for children is associated with nuts, and specifically one that has an association with Khan, who relocates from the polyhedron to the nutshell on either day 4 or day 10, depending on if you complete the House of Death quest. From day 3 onwards, you can find 2 children in the nutshell gathered around a broken lamp that they request you fix for them. If you do, it projects a starry image of the town with the polyhedron, suggesting that this more recent trinket, no more than 5 years old, broke down so quickly. This lantern is noted in an article by level designer Elena Alt to be inspired by genuine childhood memories of creating a secret hideaway and telling scary stories, which led to the idea of the nutshell, having a dedicated corner for such stories that would be nice if they could be told by lantern light. Thus, genuine happy childhood memories seeped into a corner of a game, a corner that is not entirely unadulterated for the occupants of the nutshell, such as Khan, are vulnerable to catching the plague. It is not a safe place at the same caliber as the polyhedron. It almost feels strange for such a comforting song to be in a soundtrack for a game otherwise filled to brim with despair, paralleling the game's tone and the effective experience of playing the game itself. Miracle Workshop is another comforting track. One that I often fall asleep to, but it lacks the powerful near optimism of Childhood Grave despite its grim title. Miracle Workshop is a song of respite and introspection, a cue that you are safe from the ravages of plague clouds and knife-wielding opponents. You are allowed a brief moment to catch your breath, get some sleep, and get necessary work done in a space that is decidedly your own. The song lacks the anxiety-riddled air of the themes that play in the homes of Otherbound, with beds to spare such as that which plays in Lara's Shelter. In the solitude of the workshop, sticky occasionally at your side, you can focus yourself safely on that which needs to be done. But there is one fact about the workshop, the lair, that cannot be ignored: who it used to belong to. The workshop was once used by Artemis' father. As he works with the equipment his father once used, he may be reminded of the other hands which operated this very same equipment. As much relief as the track enveloping the workshop carries with it, there's an equal measure of absence, a fading of once supported by the long, drawn-out lilting note which resonate over long. Notes which spin as if asking a question of who, and a question of where. Discussing my personal relationship with Pathologic as it pertains to grief would be incomplete without mentioning the role fanfiction plays in my experience. I read a lot of fanfiction in the weeks following my grandmother's passing, something I hadn't done with regularity since I was a child. I was reverting back to childhood comforts so much that I began to do something I hadn't done with fervor since my early teen years. I went as far as to write fanfiction. Specifically, I wrote fanfiction about Artemis' grief. Now, I won't link the fic I wrote here, but it's not overly difficult to find. It's also not my most refined work, but it was necessary work. Fanfiction as a class of fan work operates on a different set of principles and needs that other source of material media hinges on. It exists to satisfy tonal wants, hence how dark media tends to have a lot of lighthearted fanfiction and vice versa, explores the looming what-if questions, expands upon character dynamics, and fulfills a specific kind of fan service that isn't present in canon. This impulse towards the what-ifs and felt need to rewrite the canon as written is quite similar to the stew of feelings brought on by grief. You constantly wonder about the what-if regarding the thing you are grieving. What steps could have been taken to prevent the loss, or, in the case of anticipatory grief, what desperate steps could still be taken. Pathologic has countless talented and passionate fanfiction authors that produce all kinds of stories based in the world and/or featuring its characters, and I'm not just saying that because I've written 3 of them at the time of writing. Reading and writing fanfiction helped me with my grief, not just by assisting in whittling away the hours until the day was over, and I could get further and further from that turning point in my life, but also serving as a form of escapism. I could escape into alternate reality wherein my grief made logical, narrative sense in a manner that I had mastery over. Even though I didn't have to reckon with newly discovered complications in the figure that my grandmother was, for she was generally a good woman, who meant well and didn't do anything on the scale of inflicting her hometown of the virulent plague. I felt seen processing the loss through an extra step of this fictional man. I don't quite know where I'd be in my grief without the experience of writing this fanfiction. The reminder of the loss tolls less frequently than it did a couple months ago. Though the loss hasn't slotted entirely into my reality, as I sometimes find myself forgetting that she's gone. However, in those moments of minute heartbreak, I find myself often also thinking of Artemy, who might experience a similar thing. The actual experience of playing the game was also beneficial for processing. During the long walks through the town and uninfected districts during the day where there is little to think about apart from keeping an eye out for trash cans to rifle through, I was able to really think about my feelings. Not only on the game, but what I was going through and how it relates to the experience of the sandpest epidemic. By the end, not a single surviving town person could reasonably say they were untouched by the sandpest. Statistically, they were likely to have known someone who died, most likely someone close to them. It can be easy to relegate the unnamed townspeople to the sidelines as non-factors, even more so with the repetitive use of the same set of models for them, but they represent narratively a real person that our healers can only do so much to save. They must have suffered so much heartbreak and loss over the course of the plague that only comfort they can take is that they are not alone in their suffering, as horrible as that thought is, if you linger on it too much. This thought only helps so much as even in real life you would have had difficulty finding yourself in a situation where everyone around you has never been touched by a major loss. Experiencing that fresh grief is this uniquely isolating experience where you feel a wholly wretched brand of woe that you think cannot possibly have been experienced by anyone else. A nagging part of you thinks when the people offer their condolences and share their own experiences of loss that they cannot possibly have lived through the same thing, because it feels just that unbearable to escape the moment. I remember all too well the day I learned of my grandmother's passing, which I had spent, funnily enough, at my friend's house drawing cardstock cutouts of pathologic healers. Being whisked away back to my friend's apartment with all of my available friends to help keeping me distracted. I remember feeling simultaneously shatteringly alone and the most loved I've ever felt in my life. I was tremendously lucky to have the support on a day I consider the worst of my life thus far. I remember in the days that followed being back at that friend's apartment, talking about my plans for my Pathologic crossover Yulia Ava fanfiction, as it had nothing to do with my grandmother. As if me talking about my intentions for depicting my dearly beloved Doom Sapphics had nothing to do with how my grandmother was the first family member I ever came out to in a moment of panicked tears after she unknowingly picked me up from a high school gay-straight alliance meeting. As if me talking about renaming ideas for side characters had nothing to do with the fact that I gave my grandmother the nickname she carried for the rest of her life through my child self-nonsense babble. As if nothing about my writing I was doing both to escape and confront my feelings, had to do with her absence. Maybe it's weird to say that my gay video game fanfiction is in a way dedicated to my late grandmother, but it wouldn't have existed without her. She wouldn't have understood it, but she would have supported me if I could have ever gotten over the mortification of attempting to explain it to her. I can't change her fate. I couldn't have done anything to save her from a sudden death to an unknown cause. Pathologic strangely helps me feel more at peace with this because you can't save everyone, and you can't truly best death, no matter how hard our favorite thanatologist tries. Especially not a death that comes to collect so suddenly in the night. All that remains is to pick up the pieces and forge a new path towards the future which you can control, in part. At least until your own demise. But until then, you can cultivate meaningful connections with the world and its people to make it all worthwhile. New grief is inevitable along the way, but at least it follows new love that you have never known before. As the curtains close on my grandmother's earthly existence, she continues to linger in the realm of memories, a domain dominated by stories that I may not be inclined to tell so openly or directly, but still persist in underlying each tale that I spin. I am not spiritual, but there is an undeniable spirit that becomes inextricably laced in the work that follows a loved one's passing, either directly attributed to their character of the lost person themselves, or embedded in the feelings that are evoked by their passing and the yet living person that has yet to come to terms with this change. This is similar to how I feel about the influences of every person I've ever loved. Even when the story is absent the superficial characteristics and symbolic markers of love, it is my love that builds the foundation, paves the way for the words, and keeps the lights on for those that occupy it, even if only for a little while. To witness my stories, even those I claim sole authorship of, is to witness the subtle, ghostly collaboration of all my loves and losses. Pay too much mind to the fringes of the stage, and you might notice a stagehand who bears an uncanny resemblance to my first love, wielding poisonous passions they inspire to set the scene. Or you may notice gripping a light, a flash of a wrinkled hand of some long-departed loved one, the contours of their unseen face long eroded by the ravages of time and memory. New members may join the production, never to fully leave, though their touch may fall more obscure. It is this silent cast that enables me to artfully execute not only my craft, but also my capacity to engage with the haunted stories of others. Merely human, I cannot help but wonder at the wounds and ghosts that compel other directors, weaving their tale in an act of creation only a few lofty steps removed from grieving children playing make-believe with their dolls. If you've gotten this far, I want to thank you for watching. This was a deeply personal video to make, but I knew I couldn't write about any other subject for my first video. It always had to be personal. I also want to thank my supportive friends who have encouraged me to take this path, particularly Lori, who helped me with the language for articulating my thoughts on childhood grave. Lastly, I am declaring this now for accountability purposes. I intend on making another Pathologic video, as previously mentioned, on the topic of women in Pathologic. This is a topic I expect will fetch an interesting comment section, if left unchecked. But I have a lot to say on the topic, and I feel that much of it needs to be discussed. I agonize a great deal over this video, but I had to accept that it will never be enough. It will never envelop neither the entirety of my grief, nor cover the immensity of my love for this game. Much like how we tend to feel that we did not love The Departed enough, a singular work on a game will never be enough. I am grateful to have the luxury of being able to revisit this topic in the future, especially upon the release of Pathologic 3 next year. This is not a luxury I am afforded with those I have lost except in the realm of dreams. Thank you again for watching. You can subscribe to my channel for more essays like and unlike this one in the future. You can also find more of my writing and other work, primarily zines, on my website, wolfpitmachine.neocities.org. Take care and see that you do not become disconnected from the world. Do not deprive yourself of unfathomable love for fear of the grief that comes in its wake.